There was more than one conversation in my Unitarian Universalist ministers' circles asking which text will people be using this Sunday from Dr. King. Several people shared that they were referencing Beyond Vietnam, his speech against war. Others, of course, focused on his famous I Have a Dream speech. At least one colleague is using the text of his Ware lecture to the Unitarian Universalists from 1966. Another said she was following from his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Community or Chaos? Dr. King certainly left us a considerable amount of material to work with. I'm not sure when it became a common tradition among us to honor Dr. King's message each January. An obvious possibility is its connection with the 1983 when MLK Day was officially declared a national holiday. It does not seem as if there was a concerted effort from anywhere in the UUA to make this happen. It just seems to have been more organic. I certainly feel a need to speak about racism and democracy and justice each year in connection with this holiday. Similar to how I feel a need to preach about forgiveness around the time of Yom Kippur every year. It just feels needed. And now is a good time to bring it up. It's part of my regular liturgical calendar. King's words are for me like liturgical scripture. Text keeps reappearing on my Sunday calendar year after year. Of course, there is a danger with this line of thinking. It does happen that people will only talk about the happy, peaceful parts of Dr. King's message, and only at this one time of the year. Whitewashing is the unironic term for such behavior. The question can arise also, why only King? Why have this heavy focus on his words as if no one else ever spoke eloquently or powerfully? Remember Ella Baker, who said, until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of white mothers' sons, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. And Jackie Robinson, who said, I am not concerned with you liking or disliking me. All I ask is that you respect me as a human being. And we do well to remember that in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist, was first spoken by Angela Davis. And perhaps you know or don't know Malcolm X, who said, we can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace until he has his freedom. And any of those voices would be a solid focusing center for a sermon on racism, democracy, and justice. And for a more contemporary voice, listen to Alicia Garza, founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, who said, the fight is not just being able to keep breathing. The fight is actually to be able to walk down the street with your head held high and feel like I belong here, or I deserve to be here, or I just have a right to have a level of dignity. So why all the focus on Dr. King? I'll start by agreeing that our ears should not only be open to the words of Dr. King on the topic of racism and democracy and justice. I will make a note to myself that I'm going to be doing a sermon on James Baldwin next year, probably not in January. And I don't think I have done a sermon on the relationship between Dr. King and Malcolm X. I'll put that on my list coming up as well. But I'm going to keep bringing Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s message to this congregation for two reasons. First, King has achieved a mythic level of acceptance in our society, and it would be a waste to ignore him when speaking about the very issues that were central to his life's work. King's message already has a foothold in our broader culture. His legacy is sufficiently entangled with our nation's story such that the message is already in the room. The second reason I continue to focus on King is because his message is still relevant to our situation today. I need to hear his message still. He has a nuanced and deep enough offering in what he said more than half a century ago that we are still working toward his vision. And perhaps a third reason is something I've been pondering lately and is expressed in the title that I chose for this morning's sermon, Martin's Letter as Biblical Epistle. I don't mean to suggest that we turn King into a saint or treat all of his writings and speeches as the holy and infallible Word of God. I don't treat the actual Bible that way, so of course I'm not suggesting we do so with his work either. But let me pause for a moment and unpack the word epistle. It's a fun word. Like many Bible-y sounding words, it comes to us from Greek through Latin. It essentially means a long formal letter. Many people simply refer to those books in the Bible as the letters, or more commonly by the recipient community. So 1 Corinthians, for example, would be the first of the two letters that Paul wrote to the church community in the city of Corinth. Apostle Paul wrote many of the epistles that we have in the Bible, or at least the first handful. Several others were written in his style. And when I say long formal letter, I will share that King's letter from the Birmingham Jail is a little shorter than Paul's longest letter in the Bible, Romans, about 7,000 words. Biblical scholars agree that the letters from Paul are the earliest Christian writings. The Gospels, which are accounts of Jesus' ministry, were written decades later. Paul wrote his letters to these young congregations, addressing concerns of doctrine and behavior, encouraging them to live and act in more Christ-like ways. In recent years, people have occasionally offered letters written in the spirit of Paul, following Paul's format or using some of Paul's language or echoing the kind of message Paul offered. In that sense, Dr. King's letter from Birmingham Jail can be seen as a letter written to the white Christian churches of America. Indeed, in the letter from Birmingham Jail, King even suggests this interpretation of his letter, explaining why he traveled from Atlanta to Birmingham. For the demonstration, he wrote, "I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their 'Thus saith the Lord' far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as Apostle Paul left his little village in Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to practically every hamlet and city in the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid." So consider Dr. King, like Apostle Paul, crafting a letter to a community in need of guidance, in need of clarity, and dare I say correction. The general thrust of this letter is an articulation of how we have a moral responsibility to use nonviolent direct action to oppose unjust laws, rather than wait for justice to be delivered through the courts. In this way, it is an updated and in-the-trenches version of Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. "Unjust laws exist," Thoreau had written. "Shall we be content to obey them, or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded, or shall we transgress them at once?" Men generally, under such a government as this, think they ought to wait until they have persuaded the majority to alter them, Thoreau continued. They think that if they should resist, the remedy would be worse than the evil. But it is the fault of the government itself that the remedy is worse than the evil. It makes it worse. And a little over 100 years later, Dr. King felt compelled to articulate the same sentiment when white clergy in Birmingham questioned his actions, suggesting he could wait. King responded saying, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Do not blame the oppressed for the way they cry out in their oppression. Instead, join them Thoreau, again, had said, "Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine." Dr. King kept a dog-eared copy of that short essay, Civil Disobedience, on hand for moral sustenance and encouragement. In his 1963 book, Strength to Love, Dr. King wrote, "The trailblazers in human, academic, scientific, and religious freedom have always been nonconformists. In any cause that concerns the progress of humankind, put your faith in the nonconformists." I hasten to clarify at this point that the hard work of a civil disobedience campaign is that it is not just a moment for nonconformists to act out. A civil disobedience campaign is organized and thoughtfully enacted, prayerfully enacted. It is not a simple step to take, and is certainly not one to be taken in isolation. The main argument in Dr. King's letter from Birmingham Jail is similar to that of Thoreau 100 years before him. Unjust laws call for a moral opposition, and we cannot wait for the oppressor to set the timetable for the oppressed people's freedom. I'm sure the work looks differently today. Witness the difference between the Black Lives Matter movement and the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And as I hear myself saying these words now, as if I'm describing what happened in the 60s civil rights work and the current Black Lives Matter work, as if they're not the same ongoing piece of work. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability, as it says in Birmingham chapter 4, verse 24, if I may be so playfully bold. Progress is not inevitable. When King said the arc of the moral universe is long but it bends toward justice, he never meant to imply that we can just sit back and wait for the universe to do the bending all on its own. Progress is not inevitable. It comes, King wrote, through the tireless effort and persistent work of people willing to be the co-workers with God. Yes, we have done away with the lunch counter and drinking fountain version of segregation. Yes, we have had black astronauts and black senators and black billionaires and a black president. Yes, there has been progress. But the rise of white nationalism and the flare-up of white supremacy culture has been vitriolic and violent recently. The reason we keep quoting King in our congregations is because we're not done. King's call for justice still serves our current situation, and it may take the form of fighting militarism or poverty. King certainly linked those two evils with racism as we experience it in our country. Racism, militarism, and economic inequality, he wrote back then. King would certainly applaud resistance against war and efforts to alleviate poverty as complementary to our anti-racism work. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. Let our lives be the counter-friction to stop the machine. As we prepare to go forth into the world from this morning, let us keep King's call in our hearts. Let his eloquence ring in our ears. We can yet work to end racism. We can still take part in the struggle against endless war. We can still do more right here in Binghamton in the struggle against poverty. Let us go forth ready to bend the moral arc of the universe a bit more toward justice today. Let us go forth ready to help realize the dream King spoke about by working to feed the hungry, to house the homeless, to care for the sick. Let us speak out against racism and the ways it corrodes the soul of our nation. Let us share in the dream together today. And let us have our hearts spurred into action once again to do the work to build the beloved community for today. In a world without end, may it be so. Let us join